Okay, hi everyone. Welcome to our first Hope in the Dharma session, the first of 3 sessions. And today we have Guy Newland, PhD, who is a scholar of Tibetan Madhyamaka, and his teachers include Jeffrey Hopkins and Loleng Geshe Palden Drakpa. He is a translator and editor of Tsongkhapa's great treatise on the stages of the path to enlightenment, and of His Holiness the Dalai Lama's teachings on that text, From Here to Enlightenment. Guy is the author of Introduction to Emptiness, Appearance and Reality, The Two Truths, and A Buddhist Grief Observed. So there is the chat box here, and then if you want to raise your hand, there's a hand raising feature at the bottom. And then if you could please mute when you're not talking. And also the center is run by volunteers and donations, so I'll put a link in the chat at the end for donations. And all right, Guy, it's all yours.
Thank you, Veronica. Thank you, everybody, for coming and giving me this opportunity to think through this topic, which seems a bit au courant, we could say, relevant. I was telling Veronica before we started that last February of 2024, I started to have this feeling that Trump was going to be the next president. And then I started thinking about this topic. How to have hope in seems like very difficult circumstances. And I did write some things about it, and then more recently, since as things have turned out, I've seen that other teachers are actually writing about this, and there's been stuff in the Dharma magazines, and also Joan Halifax has had some stuff at the Upaya Zen Center. So I'd already been thinking about it, but in preparation for tonight, I looked into what some other people were saying too, and just kind of pulled some things together to share with you. I have a PowerPoint that I'll run, and I mean, my plan, who knows when I'll run out of things to say, but I'll talk for about an hour, and then we'll work through whatever questions have gone into the chat box in the meantime, and then whatever questions people want to ask by unmuting themselves and so forth. That's the plan. Now, as for how that plan relates to what we do in the next 2 sessions, I'm actually not very sure. When I've done these 3-session teachings at Shantideva before, I usually had a pretty clear idea what I would do in 1, 2, and 3. And in this case, I really don't. I'm going to share what I've thought about this issue up to this point, and then we'll see where it goes. Okay. So I'm going to start out with some Pali Canon stuff. And of course, there are relevant teachings in the Pali Canon. I think we don't have to elaborate on how frustrated and anxious, how much pain there is over the current state of the world, political situation, state of the climate, and so forth. It's pretty widely shared. It seems like an important time to think about whether the Dharma has anything to, what it has to offer us in this particular kind of situation. I guess that's what got me thinking about this in the first place. And also, this also relates to the fact that for a long time in the West, there's been a general sense that Buddhism is pretty much the most pessimistic, negative religion that there could possibly be, because of starting with the First Noble Truth, looking at all of our experience in the world as we know it as being stressful and source of dissatisfaction. And in addition, putting forth an attainment of liberation from that has been seen in the West, at least, as even more negative since the time of Schopenhauer down to today, I would say still. Yeah, obliteration. Nirvana as obliteration. So yeah, I just think that's kind of the tangle that we find ourselves in now. And this is actually a question so I was talking about with Veronica briefly right before we started. I mean, I think there has to be some feeling, even amongst ourselves, that there's something un-Buddhist about hope. And I think that there is, depending on how you understand what the word hope means. So originally, my own thought was to distinguish hope from optimism and try to redeem hope as something that's valuable and important in a spiritual life and distinguish it from optimism. But now, since I've been reading what other Buddhist teachers have been saying since the election, yeah, there's another way to do it, and that is to talk about hope that is mere optimism versus a wiser kind of hope. And the only advantage of that vocabulary over my original vocabulary is that when you look up hope in the dictionary, it pretty much does sound like the closest possible cousin to optimism. And so to just merely use that word to mean something different might be a bit of a stretch. So this is this is almost, I could say it's a quote from Veronica, but it's actually a quote from Joan Halifax. Yeah. Apparently she's been thinking about it for a long time before the recent events. And she quotes Shunryu Suzuki Roshi, that life is stepping onto a boat that's about to sail out and sink to the sea and sink, right? Which certainly brings up hope as we usually understand it, or conventional hope as it's usually defined, kind of pointing us in the wrong direction, setting us up for disappointment is an understatement, crushing disappointment. You know, I note that I read and I've read and taught very often Soko Morinaga Roshi's book Novice to Master, and he was very much concerned with the great matter, as it's called in Zen, the problem of what to make of life in the face of death. And it seems like a lot of the questions he dealt with that in his practice. And when he became a Roshi, a lot of people ask him questions related to their fears of death and their fears of growing old. And then, yeah, he says in the context of talking about that of course, over the course of life, we lose things. We lose friends, we lose loved ones, we lose our teeth, right? We lose our hair. It's like, yeah, lose my ability to read without glasses and so forth, right? Yeah. Gradually declining of various kinds of capacities as we age. And yeah, it's not only a matter of losing, because you can be gaining in other axes, right? But yeah, you can't say it's that's an upward trajectory, right? Yeah. So this also, problem of hope in Buddhism relates to the idea of three doors of liberation. Probably you might have heard of that construct, right? From the Mahayana tradition, that the three doors of liberation are selflessness or emptiness and signlessness. And the third door of liberation is wishlessness, right? So yeah, which is some, Thich Nhat Hanh has some essays about wishlessness where he defines it as a Zen teacher in terms of aimlessness, not having a particular aim or goal that you're grasping after, right? Right. And that does seem, if you just take it out of context of everything else that Thich Nhat Hanh did and said, it seems like it would tend towards a kind of passivity or quietism, as you know, the word has been used to characterize Buddhism in the West. Because we don't have, you know, of course, what they're actually meaning is not having any ego-based gaining mind. Gaining mind was the Suzuki Roshi phrase, you know, trying to acquire some, I want to get something called enlightenment. So let's looking at the Pali Canon a little bit. There's the Unbinding Sutta, which is longer than what I've quoted here, but this is the gist of it. It's actually the teacher in that sutta is Sariputta in Pali, and he says to the monks gathered there to listen to him, "This unbinding is pleasant, friends. This unbinding is pleasant." Well, liberation is something pleasant. That's what he says, right? And so they're like, okay, well, what do you mean by that? Because that sounds like, you know, some kind of sense object that you would be attached to or something like that, where of course he's talking about nibbana, right? And in explaining, he says, well, whatever is an affliction is stress or suffering, dukkha. And so by this line of reason, it may be known how unbinding is pleasant because it's the cessation of something that's painful or stressful, causing suffering. And then there's the Unborn Sutta, which is the Buddha speaks. And this is a very brief sutta. It has like 2 short paragraphs in which the Buddha says, there is, monks, an unborn, an unbecome, an unmade, an unfabricated. And if there were not that unborn, unbecome, unmade, unfabricated, there would not be the case that escape from the born, made, become, fabricated would be discerned. So there's something that's beyond the conditioning of cyclic existence, and that's what makes it possible to be liberated, whatever. And then, of course, is referring to nibbana, which is often characterized as being unconditioned in some sense. But precisely because there is an unborn, unmade, unfabricated, escape from the born, made, fabricated is discerned, right? Yeah. So that's hope. That's our hope, is that there is something other than this tangle or mess that we find ourselves in. And it doesn't have to be in a different place. It could be right here, right now, right? But if we're not tuned into it, if we're not aware of it, then it seems remote. And then this metaphor of being tangled up, right, comes from the Pali Canon, and it's featured as a starting point for the path of purification by Buddhaghosa, which is like the most important Dharma treatise, or should I say Dhamma treatise of the Theravada tradition. And Buddhaghosa demonstrated his mastery of, as an Indian person going to Sri Lanka, he demonstrated his mastery of the Buddha's word by writing this massive commentary, and the commentary was based on this single set of sutra verses. When a wise man established in virtue develops consciousness and understanding, then as a bhikkhu ardent and sagacious, he succeeds in disentangling the tangle. The inner tangle and the outer tangle. This generation is tangled in a tangle. Who succeeds in disentangling the tangle? Right? And then the Buddha says, when a wise man established in virtue develops consciousness and understanding, then as a bhikkhu, ardent and sagacious, he succeeds in disentangling the tangle. So there's these 3 things, right? Virtue, consciousness, and understanding, right? And this turns out to be the way that this particular sutta, as quoted in the Path of Purification, is talking about what we call the three trainings. So virtue, identifying actions and mental states that are and are not respectively conducive to our well-being and the well-being of others, and then training ourselves in cultivating, developing, fostering through practice and repetition the kinds of mental states and activities that are conducive to our well-being and to the well-being of others. And then consciousness refers to calming and stabilizing and settling our attention so that it becomes a powerful tool. And then understanding here refers to like what we usually call wisdom, knowing what is as it is, seeing things as they are rather than how we're habitually trained to see them, or we're habitually conditioned to seeing them, or how we would wish to see them. Instead, coming to see that everything that we grasp at is painful and quickly slipping away and devoid of any essential nature. And I phrase that in terms of the three marks that through realization of which you enter into the path to nibbana in the Pali Canon based tradition of Theravada. That is, that things are suffering, things are impermanent, and things are devoid of self. That's understanding. So, but then there is this question, what is this unborn? Everything we know is conditioned, and the Buddha says our hope is our prospect of liberation from the tangle of our world is in something else. But what could that possibly be? So I want to say at this point something that I've said in like all the talks I've done for some years, and that is that the way to think about this is that, Dr. Buddha is like a doctor, right? We take refuge in the Buddha as in a doctor. And the Dharma, therefore, is the courses of therapy or the medicines to which that the Buddha has taught or prescribed, right? And it's not just one, right? It's said in Mahayana text that there are 84,000 remedies in the Dharma. I don't know how that number is worked out, but I think it's just intended to mean one hell of a lot, right? And the idea is that they're not all good for everybody all the time. And some things that are suitable to be taught to some people, and some are suitable to be taught for other people. And that's the best way to think about differences with our fellow Buddhists, right? That some people might not be able to might not talk about emptiness the way we do, and they might think that the way we're talking about it is unnecessarily negative and misleading and wrong, right? And we may think that their way of talking about it is absolutist and reifying, right? But it could also be the case that each of us is getting the particular kind of medicine that's best for us, because you do have like so many different sutras that teach so many different ideas, right? About the nature of reality, for example, but also different practices you could do. So just in a general sense, when we think about what the unborn is, or what it is that what it is that through knowing which we become liberated, there's like half the Buddhist world, we'll say, just for the sake of argument, takes this to be that we are fundamentally non-different from Buddhas from the very beginning. We are Buddhas and just don't know it. And this is our innate, unchanging Buddha mind, right? Which is fully developed in many people's understanding, but completely latent within us, not manifested, right? And they see that as something ultimately real. To some people see it as something ultimately real. Some don't. But then there's other people who more along the lines how I usually talk, understand the unborn as the emptiness of our mind's emptiness or devoidness of having any fixed nature. It doesn't have a fixed nature of being intrinsically compassionate, for example, as I've heard some Kagyupas say. Doesn't have any fixed nature, right? And doesn't have any fixed nature, therefore, that holds it in this tangle. We're not locked into this tangle. We're in this tangle, but we have the capacity to be liberated because there's nothing that's holding us in. But whether you say, Buddha is our ultimate nature or emptiness is our ultimate nature, most people end up stressing that we can't really know it in the way we ordinarily think of knowing, right? You could understand some ideas that try to express it, right? And people use words to talk about it, like everybody does, right? But then, the Mahayana Sutras all talk about samgimikyaba in Tibetan, meaning it's inconceivable. Like however you talk about it, it's not something that we can fully conceive just in the way that it exists. So in some sense, you can say, and this is actually in some of the Perfection of Wisdom sutras, that we know the unborn by way of unknowing. That is, by letting go of everything that we think we can hold on to, all the ways of knowing with which we're familiar. And an regular Gelugpa way of talking about this is just to say we have to transcend any kind of dualistic perception. A conceptual image of emptiness is definitely not emptiness, right? Itself, yeah. And as long as we're understanding emptiness conceptually from the words of our teachers, then we're not actually knowing emptiness directly. We're knowing this image or idea of emptiness. And then everybody also says, and of course, the sutras say that the unborn is inexpressible, it's inconceivable, it's inexpressible, but that, as the sutta itself says, it's liberation, it's liberating, and there isn't any liberation or any possibility of being liberated apart from this, right? And also that it's not somewhere else, right? It seems like something utterly unfamiliar, right? Because everything we know is conditioned, and we think about all our conditioned things in a dualistic way. And they're saying, yeah, but the one thing that gives us the prospect of liberation is something that's not like that at all, but it's not in a different place. It's right here, right now. And this made me think of the passage in the Vimalakirti Nirdesha Sutra where one of the monks is talking to the Buddha, and you say, why is this world where you have appeared and are teaching the Dharma so cruddy, right? Why is there all this garbage and crap all over the place, and it's just like a filthy place full of all these kinds of ugly and dirty things? And the Buddha said, well, that's just your mind. That's a reflection of your mind, right? And it's not the way an awakened being would see this world. They see it as the mandala, you could say, in Tibetan way. And then the Buddha, like, I don't know, presses his big toe on the ground or something like that, and gives Shariputra a vision of Earth, actually, as it is from an awakened point of view. Yeah. That kind of thing caused Bob Thurman to claim that the Vimalakirti Sutra was really covertly tantric or proto-tantric. Anyway, so there's another very on-the-nose passage about hope in the Pali Canon, where in the Anguttara Nikaya, the Buddha says, there are three kinds of people in the world: the hopeful, the hopeless, and the one who has done away with hope. Right. So in this case, hope means expectation. And I know that because I read the rest of the sutra. So the idea is that there's somebody who has a miserable social status. They're very poor, low caste, and so forth. And they don't have any hope or prospect of having anything better ever, right? So they're the hopeless. And then it gives the example of somebody who is a very high status prince, say, for example, but this person has strong expectations of being made king, right? And so if somebody else is made king instead, that doesn't work out so well. That's the one who has, that's the hopeful one in the Anguttara Nikaya. The one who has done away with hope then is described as a person who just sees things as they are in the moment without constructing and grasping after certain expectations about what needs to appear in the future, right? Yeah, that's how it reads. And yeah, these words, the words like realist and observant are not in the sutra, but I just, describe to you. So first they use these examples about social status, and then the sutra goes on to say, well, it's the same thing with spiritual attainment. There's some people who don't think that any spiritual attainment is possible and are completely, cynical and disregarding to any kind of practice whatsoever. That's the hopeless. And then there's people who practice diligently, very specifically having in mind what Suzuki Roshi calls a gaining idea. That is, they're expecting to get something right out of it and can be disappointed when they practice and don't get what they thought they were going to get, like, say, realizing nirvana. And then there, the realists, again, people who see things for they are without grasping after expectations about what's supposed to happen next. So you can see that this is a way that Buddha himself in the Anguttara Nikaya makes this distinction. It does, and instead of saying there's some kind of thing called wise hope, or there's a difference between hope and optimism, he's saying, yeah, there's people who have done away with hope in the sense of having done away with expectations that they're grasping after about what's supposed to happen next. Okay. So now I'm going to just say my thoughts about this up to this point. Okay. And I've decided for this purpose to adopt Joan Halifax's phrase, wise hope, right? So wise hope is hope that it has no expectations. What would it be? Wise hope is based on uncertainty. She likes to say radical uncertainty, but I don't know. Uncertainty, not knowing. It's based on not knowing. Yeah. Things are constantly changing and one doesn't know how they're going to change. And right, they have no fixed nature. So there's nothing, you can't say there's any that they are certainly this or that and will remain so, right? So emptiness or openness or impermanence, points us in the direction of uncertainty or knowing that we don't know rather than thinking that we know what's supposed to happen. And at the same time, the other part of that is values, right? That we have commitments, we have the cultivation of bodhicitta, we have vows or precepts that we take, we have the notion that loving care is a sensible and appropriate way to relate to other people, right? So I don't know if it's, you can stretch this a little bit and saying, well, I'm just basically talking about a way of talking about wisdom and method, and putting method sort of basically the values that seem a sensible way to live, right? But then at the same time, not having any certainty or expectation about what's supposed to happen, right? So in other words, it's wisdom to know that we don't know the future. And in fact, we don't really know anything in an absolute way, right? We think we have reasonable belief. We have good reason to believe and act on the belief that we have some kinds of knowledge. And we do act on the beliefs about our knowledge all the time. But many times, there's things that we thought were definitely true that turn out later not to have been true. And once we recognize that, and we know that, and we know that no objects have some essential nature out there that our mind can reach out and grasp onto, then we have to acknowledge that, knowledge is what we take as knowledge, and what we rely on knowledge is potentially revisable, as in the scientific method, right? Yeah. And it's also wise, on the other hand, to know, have the conviction that our choices really make a difference. I think our choices do make a difference, right? Our choices affect the world, even when it seems like maybe they don't, right? And that's the other side of it. That's where hope lies, in knowing that even though we don't know the future, we know that our choices matter. And so we persist in a determined way, right? In making choices that go in the direction, right, of our values. So back to Joan Halifax. Yeah, she says, wise hope is resilient. It's not optimism. It's rooted in understanding the uncertainties of life. And a wisely hopeful person will prepare for various outcomes while active, because they take into account that you don't really know what the outcome will be, while actively seeking ways to make a positive difference in the world. And she gives an example from Barbara Kingsolver, the novelist, who talks about a pessimist as being a person who figures that with a really bad winter coming, we're all going to freeze and starve. And so there's no point in doing anything, because there's no hope that we'll have food to get through the winter. And the optimist is a person who's thinking, well, I'm sure we'll have enough food. So they don't think there's any necessary to take any particular action either. So you see with that example is like the optimist and the pessimist are equally not acting, right, for opposite reasons, right? And the realistic person, right, the wisely hopeful person, is the one who thinks, well, we don't really know whether we'll be starving to death in February or not, but maybe if there's somebody still alive, they could, use some of the roots that I'm storing up in the cellar, right? And so you take positive action. Yeah. All right. So this is a really important attitude, right, to take. I mean, you can understand, I'm talking about our situation in the world now. It's very easy to go from frustration and a sense of futility into despair and passivity. And it's sometimes it seems like our actions aren't making a difference. So when we're in that kind of situation, I think it's really important to make this kind of distinction, to be realistic about this situation, and to try to take into account that you don't really know what's going to happen, and we can take actions that make a difference based on different possible contingencies. But when we let go of the need for certainty, we create a space for all kinds of possibilities to emerge and transformations. And when we can work within that space to think, how will we deal with different circumstances that might come about? And it's crucial to remember that what we do matters. How we speak to one another, how we care for the environment, how we respond to the challenges we face. It always makes a difference. And this is the fundamental, to me, this is the core spiritual message, and not just the moralistic message of the teaching of karma, is that your actions always matter to the future. Yeah. So this is the whole poem that I was referring to earlier, talking to Brent in the beginning of my book, Introduction to Emptiness. I quote this poem. This is the whole poem. This is a guy who happened to teach it at my university. Some will tell you it doesn't matter, and that's a lie. Every single thing matters, and nothing good happens fast. Yeah. So yeah, stuff matters. Now I wanted to give you a really different example that you also probably have not heard before. It's from a woman named Olive Schreiner. She was a progressive and a reformer in South Africa. Her parents were missionaries in the early 20th century. And, she recognized the extreme levels of injustice that surrounded her. And it's like, well, what is she going to do about it, right? Yeah, she's one white woman in South Africa in 1910 or whatever, right? Limited prospects from, right? So she has this dream that is published in a book. She writes these short stories that are basically based on her dreams. And in this one, there's a woman who's walking across a desert, and she comes towards where there's a river, and there's a man there, and the man represents reason. And she says, how can I get to this river and get across to the other side? And he said, well, there isn't any bridge, right? And then he says, well, some people are just going to have to go down there and make a bridge with their bodies as they drown for other people to walk over. And she says, well, what about the people who got onto the river first and they're just swept away and nobody hears them again, and their bodies don't even make a bridge for other people later? And he says, well, they're swept away and they're heard of no more. And what about it? And she says, well, what of them? And he says, they make a track to the water's edge. So the edge of the water is down the bank, and there's thick brush, between us and the actual opportunity to drown or build a bridge. And somebody has to beat a track, down to the water's edge. They'll make a track to the water's edge and over that bridge that will be built with our bodies. The entire human race will pass. And she heads down to the river. Okay, so that was a dream that she had. And I think this dream sort of embodies this idea of like, well, you just keep doing the right thing, even if you don't expect or hope that your particular efforts will bear fruit. And it gets comparable, in the biblical traditions to Moses not making it to the promised land, or Martin Luther King, I have a dream speech specifically saying that I might not get there with you, right? And it also reminds me of this quote from George Eliot's Middlemarch. The good of the world is partly dependent on unhistoric acts. These are the people who got swept away, right? Unhistoric acts. And that things are not so ill with you and me as they might have been is half owing to a number who lived faithfully a hidden life and rest in unvisited tombs. It's like, oh, we need the tomb of the unknown bodhisattva, basically, right? They're people who are never heralded or recognized either in their communities or in the nation, right? Who engage in lives of kindness and self-sacrifice on behalf of others, and are motivated by those things. And that seems like super inspiring. And that's what, George Eliot, now she doesn't say here that she's talking, mostly about a certain kind of person, right? But in a traditional patriarchal situation, the majority of these hidden bodhisattvas are going to be women, in my opinion. Now, sort of looking into this more in preparation for this, I came across Rebecca Solnit's Hope in the Dark. So I don't know that Rebecca Solnit identifies as a Buddhist, but I don't honestly know if she does or she doesn't. But she's been teaching at Joan Halifax's Upaya Zen Center in Santa Fe. And she has a book called Hope in the Dark that is like so on the nose in terms of this issue, where she wrote it, I don't know, in 2017 or 2015 or something like that, before the current situation. And I'm just give you a little bit of taste of the book, and you can see how it fits with my theme. She talks about things like the fall of the Berlin Wall, Occupy Wall Street movement, the Arab Spring, and she stresses the idea that these things are important because when you have oppressive powers that be uh, shaking in their boots, right? When something like this erupts, that in itself is significant, right? And that people will look at, say, Occupy Wall Street or the Arab Spring, and dismiss these things because of imperfections, limitations, incompleteness. But it's important to remember, like, the joy and hope that shined out from these moments, and also that real changes emerge from these things if they're not always recognized, right? And of course are not to the degree that might have been expected by the optimists within the movement, right? But it's not that they didn't make any difference, right? They did make some difference, right? Now, this is Rebecca Solnit. She says, even so-called failed actions can have a lasting transformative impact, changing the conversation and laying the groundwork for future successes. That is beating a track to the water's edge in Olive Schreiner's dream world, right? And this is still Rebecca Solnit. I'm paraphrasing a bit. She gives her favorite example is Hurricane Katrina. And she says that after the area was evacuated and sealed off, there was bumper to bumper traffic of boat owners with their trailers all going toward the evacuated area, wanting to use their boats to rescue people. And they weren't saying, I can't rescue all these people, so it's useless. I should just stay home in Texas. Instead, they were like, well, I have a boat. I can rescue someone whose house is flooded. And it's worth it to risk my life and also risk defying the authorities who are enforcing the evacuation zone, right? So she talks about that for a while, and then she says, look, change is not straightforward. It can be, it's incredibly complicated, right? How things happen based on so many causes and conditions, like as expressed in chaos theory. And also sometimes things happen so slowly that it seems like they're not changing at all. She used the example of evolution, but I threw in geology, because that's where we really have the perception that nothing's changing at all, when in fact there's like this churning massive magma underneath us, right? And think the continents are floating around. They just don't float very quickly, right? So anyway, even things that in our world seem to arise very suddenly, they actually arise from deep, sets of causes and conditions, matrices of cause and conditions, long dormant seeds that were, planted by forgotten people, forgotten bodhisattvas of the past. And then she brings up something, quoting another person. She talks about this idea of like, well, how would you live if you did have a perfect world, right? Suppose everything that you wanted to see come about in this society were actually realized, right? Then how would you live? What would it be? How would you live? What would you be fighting for then? And the idea, she says, is, well, we can start living it as close to this ideal way that we would wish to live as we can now, right? Even though, of course, we can't fully embody that. Yeah. And in the meanwhile, I think, rejoice in small acts of kindness that are happening all the time around us, and be inspired by them. It's so true. It's real. So this is Rebecca Solnit says, she's like, total transformation into a pure land on earth. It's like the secular equivalent of heaven, something permanent, complete, where there's nothing left to do. And practically, it's not going to happen. We're not going to have a perfect world built here within samsara. But at the same time, there are every day these flickers of light, of love, of people caring for each other in uncountable, unnoticed, small ways, right? I think that's important. Because basically, ordinary hope, based on wanting a certain outcome and expecting that to happen, right? It's always going to be futile, because what actually happens is unlikely to be exactly what you had in mind, right? So yeah, we always have expectations, and along with those, we have fears that those expectations won't be fulfilled. So in that sense, ordinary hope is dukkha. In that, hope as ordinarily understood is dukkha. It is part of samsaric matrix of grasping and wishing or aiming or trying to gain, like, right? Wise hope is not the belief that everything will turn out well. Obviously, things fall apart. Everything. Sometimes when I'm talking about impermanence in my class, I like to say, oh, how long do you think it'll be before the United States doesn't exist? And of course, students have never actually thought about that before, because for them, the United States seems to be like a fact of the universe, like, I don't know, gravity or something. I don't know. Right? It doesn't seem that it's built on causes and conditions and it's impermanent and will eventually, its continuum will come to an end. Yeah. So this is a guy that I don't know too well. He's a Buddhist teacher, and he gives an example of the kind of thing that I'm talking about here. He says the Buddhist teaching is fundamentally hopeful because it affirms that there's a reliable way to release ourselves from suffering and to protect other beings and to mitigate harm and to make a better world. I suffered from a chronic illness for a few years in my 30s. In the first few months, with each new doctor, my mind soared with hopeful expectations because he was suffering so much, right? And then crashed in despair when they failed to deliver. Those years taught me a lot about the difference between hope based on craving and the steady energy of wise aspiration. So he goes to using aspiration there, right? Right, instead of hope, putting hope on the craving side. I think is very simply and beautifully expressed example of what we're talking about. So yeah, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, optimism and pessimism can both be causes for passivity, failing to take action. I already used the Barbara Kingsolver example. Right. But we can be sure that things are going to keep on changing, right? Relentlessly. Yeah. And what we can, our commitments, right, to one another and the acts that we choose to engage in based on those commitments, yeah, is what we can count on, right? That's what we can commit ourselves to those choices, right? Regardless of whether we can't control all the circumstances that will come about as a result of our actions. So Joan Halifax says this. For her, this means showing up, right? She wants that to be the motto of her Zen center, right? Yeah. Found a couple other relevant quotes. These two quotes have come from Christian tradition and Jewish tradition, and I think they have a parallel to what we're talking about. Daniel Berrigan said, one cannot level one's moral lance at every evil in the universe because there are too many, but you can always do something. And the difference between doing something and doing nothing is everything. Exactly, right? And this comes from the Jewish text, Ethics of Our Fathers. You're not required to complete the healing of the world, but you may not desist, right? You have to keep on keeping on. Lajek Havel, hope is definitely not the same thing as optimism. It's not the conviction that something will turn out well, but the certainty that something makes sense. By something, he means some way of acting in the world, some way of something that we can do makes sense, regardless of how that turns out, because we can't control the ultimate outcomes. Right? So, yeah, commenting on that, Joan Halifax says, yeah, for example, it makes sense to shelter the homeless, and including refugees from war and climate devastation, to support care and medicine, and to educate girls, and to vote for women, she says. Also makes sense to sit with dying people, which is, of course, the thing that she's best known for, is her hospice training work. And we really don't know how things will turn out, but we can trust that there will be movement, there will be change, and something deep inside us affirms what is good and right to do. These are all different ways of saying the same thing. Yeah. She calls it, this is a typically Zen way of talking. They said living by vow, right? The ability to be guided by our deepest values. And she just gives a little mini autobiography of how she had to overcome a sense of hopelessness in dedicating herself to the work that she's been doing. So this is another Buddhist teacher. I hadn't heard of her before. I looked her up. She's a Buddhist monastic based in Australia, who does a lot of work supporting education for impoverished people in India. Aya Yeshe. She has a slightly different take on this. I think most of what I've been saying is taking the same line in different kinds of angles. And Aya Yeshe just sort of sets it up a little differently. And she says, yeah, for someone who's very deep into meditation and concentration, who's gone far down the path of Dharma, then hope probably is not that important. Because when we see that wisdom and joy are a basic natural condition, the clarity beneath our projections, our rich fundamental nature, then there's no need to grasp for something good coming in the future, because we know we're already complete, right? She's saying, yeah, if you're a very wise, enlightened person, then you can let go of grasping after expectations, right? Which is kind of what all the other teachers are starting saying. Yes, you should be letting go of your hopes and hopes in the sense of expectations for the future, right? But Ayeshe says, well, we're not always really connected to that awakened mind or understanding. And meanwhile, we could need a little bit of happiness or self-care or humor and kindness, as well as this long-term vision. And this kind of, more ordinary, hopeful aspiration, she compares it to bodhicitta, as we understand it, the altruistic aspiration to for liberate all beings and to establish them in Buddhahood. This is like a great sun on the horizon, even as our heart is at the same time moved by the mess and suffering of the world. And we can hold both of these realities, the prospect of saving all beings, and together with the mess that we find ourselves in together in our mind. And she said, then coming back to her idea of somebody who's gone beyond that, somebody who's, fully realized emptiness, right? In ultimate bodhicitta, can leave behind these smaller pleasures and the need for hope, because you're just naturally, spontaneously joyous, free of duality, right? But then she says, between, the relative bodhicitta and the ultimate bodhicitta might be a long time. I thought that was interesting, because she has a little bit different, she doesn't echo what everybody else is saying, but she has a different take on it. So this is a passage that Thich Nhat Hanh wrote about hope. I witnessed a lot of suffering, especially during the Vietnam War, helping to build a village for refugees in the demilitarized zone when it was bombed by the Americans because Viet Cong were hiding there. So we rebuilt it, and then it was bombed again. So we rebuilt it again, and then it was demolished again. And the third time we started discussing whether we should keep rebuilding it. It was my belief that if we gave up, the people would despair. So we rebuilt the houses a third time, and then a fourth time, and then a fifth time. If you run away from suffering, you cannot find happiness. We should face our suffering and try to identify its roots. What I liked about that is this idea of just sort of relentless determination in the face of seeming insurmountable apparently insurmountable obstacles, right? This next little part is some stuff that I wrote myself. I read about the committing suicide by, so now they have nets, metal mesh, right? So that you can't really kill yourself by jumping off the Golden Gate Bridge anymore. But you used to be able to do so, and a lot of people did, probably thousands over the years. And it proved, like, statistically, one of the most lethal ways to attempt suicide. Percentage-wise, there are very, very few people survived that fall. Fewer percentage than survived gunshot, for example, right? But somebody did a study where they went around and tracked down 500 people who had set out with the intention to jump from the bridge and were, by some circumstances, the police and so forth, were stopped from doing so, and found that only 7% of those people had actually gone on to die by suicide at any later time. I found that super interesting, right? And they also interviewed a guy who survived and asked him what he was thinking about as he was falling. And he said, I was thinking about that all the reasons that I was jumping off the bridge were problems that actually could be addressed, and thinking that I'd made a mistake. So yeah, the idea is that when hurt seems unbearable, or is unbearable, really, it's not actually completely over. When you get to the point of not having hope, there's still a kind of hope, right? Hope beyond hope. And this reminded me of this business about the long arc of history. Progressive liberalism is associated with a vision, a positive vision for the future. That's what it's called, progressive, right? And Obama quoted Martin Luther King, who was in turn summarizing a sermon by Theodore Parker and saying that the arc of history is long but bends towards justice. So there's some expectation there. It's not an expectation about what will happen tomorrow, but there's an expectation that in the long run, things will get better. And yeah, so it's a question, right? Does the long arc of history bend toward justice, or doesn't it? Eric Holder says that, yeah, it does. Yeah, he's a progressive, right? It does bend toward justice, but that's contingent upon our bending it that way. We have to act to bend the arc of history in that direction. But then, in my opinion, you're right, the final outcomes of the arc are not actually under our control, whether we take action or don't, right? Yeah. What we can control is our choices, our values, our commitments, and the choices we make, to care for others. Maybe I'll just show this one last slide. It's not the end of all my slides, but I should stop and let people ask questions and tell me what they think. So there's this super famous, I think the greatest American poets are Walt Whitman and Emily Dickinson. And Emily Dickinson's most famous poem, one of her most famous poems, is this: hope is the thing with feathers that perches in the soul and sings the tune without words and never stops at all. And it always annoys me that when people reference this poem, they just quote the first part. Oh, hope's the thing with feathers. like hope is like a little bird, or yeah, presumably she doesn't mean a hawk or an eagle, right? Yeah. Hope is a gentle little bird that perches in our soul. But what about the second part? It sings a tune without words and never stops, right? And I think that's the important part of the poem, is singing without words. Like the hope that she's talking about is like music itself, something that goes beyond rational comprehension to inhabit our bodies, to inhabit our hearts, right? And also, crucially, it doesn't stop. It never stops, right? It's relentless. It's determined. It's indomitable, right? Yeah. And that's like the vows that, East Asian Buddhist practitioners take, the four great vows. And one of them, could be translated, suffering beings are numberless. I vow to free them all. And it's like, well, when you look at it from a Gelugpa point of view, it's you're doing a paradox kind of thing again, right? But this is the commitment. It's like there's an infinite number of beings. So whether or not it's possible to save an infinite number of beings from suffering is irrelevant. Like, there have been Buddhas for a long time now, right? And yet there's still infinite suffering beings, right? And they all have a vow like this, to save all beings. And they've become the best possible helper of all beings. So the point is whether it's actually possible to save an infinite number of beings from suffering. The point is that we're infinitely committed. We, as in a Zen way of talking, we're saving them right now in our hearts with kind of an endless, inexhaustible, unconquerable, unrelenting determination to lovingly care for all beings, right? And what we're actually able to accomplish in that regard is not in our control, right? We go out and do the best we can. I'm going to stop because I feel like I've talked enough, although I do have just a few more things, and that'll give me a starting point for next time, maybe.
Thank you, Guy. That was really beautiful. Does anyone have
Thanks for listening. Yeah.
yeah. Does anyone have any questions?
This will be a first.
Mm. You can either type them in the chat or just say them out. Oh,
Is everybody too depressed to talk?
I think Bryant has his hand raised.
Bryant.
Yeah, hey,
Bryant or Brian?
like Kobe.
Oh, Kobe. Okay, Kobe
Like
Bryant.
Bryant.
Yeah,
But
no, I see your name there. I just thought she said Brian, so I was looking for a Brian who was not a Bryant. Okay.
I always quote my grandfather, I don't care what you call me, don't call me late for dinner. um, your talk was extremely fruitfully suggestive. I'll use that phrase. You've done a marvelous job of just collecting so many different facets of the jewel that is this topic of hope in the Dharma. Um, I've got a lot of potential comments. I'll just make two. One is I've got a book by, and I forget his last name, but his first initials are S.A., and he's a Sri Lankan professor. I think it's called The Buddha's Teaching. And in it, he emphasizes very strongly that people come away with this impression about the pessimistic nature of Buddhism because they read the First Noble Truth and they stop right there. And he
Yeah.
says, look, there's four truths, and the third says, there is hope, in a way, that they misconstrue the first noble truth as saying life is suffering, but I think the exact quote is there is suffering. And then
Yeah.
the third noble truth says there is a release from suffering, good news.
Yeah.
But no one seems to go that far. They just sort of stop with the first one and get bummed out, and then um,
Yeah. No, that's why that's why I tried to start by pointing at nirvana and the Pali Canon and how, yeah, it's,
but my second, and I'll just stop there. But your whole uh, career of promoting the concept of emptiness, it seems to me, if I understand it correctly, that if you really understand what emptiness is saying, there literally is always hope, because there's nothing is reified, nothing exists solidly. So therefore, hope is sort of the potential in every situation to turn for the better, dependent on actions that we take, or thoughts, or speech, or whatever. That things are always improvable at some point.
yeah, exactly. In an open-ended way, right?
Yeah.
And yeah, that's Joan Halifax likes to talk about that with words like openness and uncertainty. And it's like when you teach the seven cause and effect precepts for cultivating bodhicitta, and you get to the point of you having a genuinely altruistic mind. The question is like, yeah, I genuinely have an altruistic mind, but how could I possibly ever become a Buddha? And actually aspire to become the best possible helper of other beings requires you to take into consideration and take seriously this idea that you don't really have any fixed essence of being the kind of person that you are now. You can become a completely, you can vastly expand, unimaginably expand our powers.
Ranji, you can go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. So, Guy, I have a question. If you could say a few words about the relationship between acceptance and hope, because it seemed to me, and this is in the context of the elections, obviously, it seems to me that the first stage of having hope is actually accepting what's happened. So I don't know what the Buddhist scriptures are saying about the relationship between the two.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I'll go back to the passage from Anguttara Nikaya 3:13 that about there's the person with hope, the person who's hopeless, and the person who has done away with hope. So the way it's set up, it seems kind of strange that because it seems like the person who's hopeless would be the one who's done away with hope. But and when the sutta describes the one who's done away with hope, they're talking about the seeing things realistically, seeing things just as they are, right? And not imposing, in addition, on top of that, some sort of demand on reality that it turn in a certain direction, right? Yeah. That's the way the Buddha describes it in the Pali Canon, first using social oppression and then comparing that to spiritual, moral dimensions. People are trying to improve themselves, and their motivation to improve themselves is linked to an expectation that they damn well better succeed in getting to be a better person. Do you know what I'm saying? It's like, oh, and people who go out to help others, and then they get really crushed when other people don't benefit or appreciate or recognize their, you know what I'm saying? Yeah. So there has to be some kind of way that the one who is done away with hope in the Pali Canon, it's not that they don't have a determination or motivation to care for others, but they have an acceptance of the facts of the world right now as they are, and a kind of understanding that we don't actually know. We know that things will change, but we don't know actually what will happen next. But in the meantime, we're going to act in according to our values as best we can. I see that as the realism part, is optimism and pessimism going in opposite directions, some of which, well, at least, it's arguable that each of them can lead to passivity, right? If you have a realistic view, then you understand that your actions make a difference, and difference doesn't necessarily mean that you'll get what you're working for. Could be that you're one of the people who plant a seed that, bears fruit in the distant future. Or break a trail to the water's edge. Seems like everybody who showed up here feels more or less the same way. So it's my idea to try to speak to our situation.
I can add an additional thing if no one else in the moment has something. This topic also, I think, can be framed, when people talk about hope, there's almost a passivity to that attitude. Like, do you have hope or not hope? Meaning, like, will some thing, entity, whatever out there provide something for me that I want, like a better future or a better society? So in a way, it's a subtle reification of something that really doesn't exist. Hope in what? There's no existing future at all. The future's created every moment by what we're doing now. All of us here in this room are creating a future. And so in the same sense of Halifax, maybe, or the Anguttara Nikaya, get rid of just the concept of hope and focus on what can I do now to make things better, without reference to, hoping that some entity or whatever is going to, provide something. We are the providers always and the makers.
Yeah, I totally take your point, because a lot of times when people have hope, it is directed towards some outside power. But there can also be, people working hard and having commitment and making choices specifically in the hope that, and that means with the expectation that right,
Yeah.
certain thing will be attained or grasped, right?
I guess that's where I bring in the wisdom of emptiness, that, in all moments, there is that possibility for change for the better. Just,
right,
or worse, in any direction. So, yeah.
This is where I that's why I included the Aya Yeshe quote, because she, I don't know if she's completely worked it out, but she's trying to recognize that we're not all realized beings. We're not all, we aren't all the being who has done away with hope in the sense of expectation. We do have, we grasp at all kinds of things, and that includes expectations of other people, and expectations at our work, and expectations in terms of our particular actions, and being, unpleasantly surprised when our expectations in terms of a political process, right? And that's what she's saying. It's like, well, that is who we are. That's who we are for now, because we haven't all realized emptiness, and we can hold in mind, this ideal of really committing ourselves to trying to help everyone as best we can, but at the same time be realistic about that's definitely not where the world is right now. I guess what I'm saying is that, yeah, it's true what you say about emptiness, but it's
To me, the emptiness is the hope. It's
yeah. Wow.
it's the constant knowledge that your actions can have an effect for the better.
Right. They
Yeah.
can have an effect for the better, right?
They can, right?
They can, but you're not sure they will.
They're not sure, right? But you do your best, and then you course correct.
Right. Exactly. Right. Yeah. Course correcting, very important. That involves knowing that you don't really know for sure that the way you've set out is actually going to work.
My favorite analogy is sailing. Going from point A to point B is never a straight line. You're constantly tacking with the wind, going right and left, and eventually, on the average, you hit your goal, but you never go straight to it.
True. Yeah. It is, I guess, yeah, the process of working out how to be actually helpful to other people is like that. You want to help other people, and you know that you don't necessarily know what kinds of actions would be best in that regard. Try something, do your best, and then, yeah, don't assume or expect that it will necessarily work. Make an evaluation of, what needs to be refined or changed in terms of how you treat others. People who pay attention improve over time in their lives, whether they're Buddhists or not, I think, right? Because they notice how other people, they notice what works with other people and what doesn't work with other people, right? In getting along. I don't know whether you agree with me about that, but I was talking about all the things that we lose as we get older. But if you're paying attention, to what works and doesn't work as you interact with other people, there's also a way in which, it's just sort of natural to improve.
Hi again. How did I call you? Again, Guy. Yeah.
Oh, you're calling me Gen. Okay, I got it. Yeah.
It's a techie question.
Yeah.
And people here are going to be able to tell me how to do this, but I wanted to capture some of your quotes. Is the best way to do that to do a screenshot? Seriously, is that the best way? And then I've just got held on to it, so to speak.
A screenshot of the PowerPoint.
Well, like you have the PowerPoints, and you'll have this beautiful quote. That one going down to the water, just, the building. Yeah. Oh my God, I'd never.
Almost nobody knows that. Almost, yeah.
Oh God, it's so moving. And anyway, so what I did was I took my phone and I took a picture of the, you know what I mean? I thought, no, there's somebody who knows how to do this better than I do. And is it just taking a screenshot? What do you think, Veronica? You probably know your way around computers if you're doing the hostessing.
Yeah, I actually did take screenshots of the PowerPoint.
Oh, okay. So that's So next time I'll do that.
Well,
Yeah, do you know, or, yeah,
could I say something? I honestly have no problem like sharing the PowerPoint with the people who registered and attended the class.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
I've done that before
All right.
for Shanti Deva and for other places. I mean, I don't have any problem doing that. I'll just send it to you, Veronica, since you've been
Okay.
emailing.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, guys.
thank you.
And thank you again, Guy.
And Guy, thank you for that, because I was going to ask the question if you were going to, because I wouldn't take screen. I deal with privacy laws all the time, and you know, I wouldn't take. You know, people do things like that, and I'm always like, "Hey, will you share the presentation or however you want to do it?" So I'm glad you clarified that.
Well, the thing is that it's not some proprietary thing, right? That I'm trying to make money off of or something like that, right? I'm just trying to share my thoughts with you, and the extent I have anything worthwhile to share, it's you know, traces back to my teachers, and they would they would be quite disturbed if I were going around trying to make profit by sharing the Dharma, you know. His Holiness the Dalai Lama is very strict about that. If you've gone to any of his talks, right?
What do you mean?
Well, if somebody sponsors a talk by the Dalai Lama, then for the last several years anyway, he requires the organizers to come
Oh, yeah.
to the stage and give an accounting of how much money they collected from the people who are in attendance and what they're spending it on and what they will do with any surplus that's left over. They have to state that in public, because you don't want, say, like in 2008, when I did that book From Here to Enlightenment, if I remember correctly, it was Lafayette University sponsored him, and and along with the Tibetan Buddhist Learning Center, and you know, they charge people to come there, right? And so, you know, he wanted to make it clear that this wasn't a profit making thing. You know, in Tibetan, you can't sell the Dharma, right? You can't sell Dharma books either. Obviously, they cost something, right? So if you go to a Tibetan bookstore in India, for example, in Dharamsala, for example, if you go to or Kathmandu, that you have to pay to get the book, right? But on the other hand, they're not going to call it a price. Because there has to be, you have to maintain the idea that the Dharma is available freely.
Right.
And so it's sort of like they call it a ransom in Tibetan, which seems strange, but what we call it a suggested donation, right?
Donation. It's a donation.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. So I'll share that. And I really don't know what I'm going to do next week. I may spend some more time with Rebecca Solnit's book, and I'll probably, yeah, you know me, I'll probably bring in some more stuff about emptiness as well. Yeah. That seems like a good place to stop, Veronica.
Okay, yeah. Well, thank you everyone for coming, and thank you, Professor Guy, for your enlightening insights. It was really, really wonderful and very helpful.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. Yeah, and listening.
Yeah.
It actually is helpful to me to be to think to work through these things.
Mm-hmm.
We're all in that regard kind of in the same situation, right?
Yep.
Can I say a word?
Oh, sure.
I think in Buddhism, I know from my experience, it's so easy to get down a rabbit hole of technical verbiage and topics that are, splitting hairs, and we lose the larger picture of what is all this for. And I think this topic can be included in that. What is all this for? I mean, how to live life in a more hopeful, way, how to give people hope, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, that's a good comment. That gives me an idea for something I could talk about a little bit more next time. I got a query from a person I don't know in Hawaii this week who asked me if I could explain or give any examples about how understanding emptiness would actually be related to people being more caring towards others in the world. And
Oh,
yeah, so that, I think that's an interesting and relevant topic here. So
yes. Good.
yeah. Okay. Good night, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you.
night.
Good night. Thank you.
Good night.